All right, we are live. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful, actually. Thank you for asking. Obviously, we met at the gym. Go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm currently an instructor for higher ed education, as well as a PhD student, halfway through my PhD career.
And what is your field of study?
Sustainability.
Sustainability. Interesting. What, let's go deeper into sustainability, because sustainability is like a very general, what are you sustaining exactly?
That is a very complex answer.
Okay.
Sustaining, it can mean many different things. When we talk about the environment, we refer to something called the triple bottom line, and that looks at economics, society, and the environment, the needs of all three.
Okay. In triple bottom line, but for what?
So
for entertainment?
No.
Okay.
Take in consideration, for example, fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels, yep, that's a very big topic right now.
Yes,
in politics.
very controversial. So we need fossil fuels to light your kitchen, for example, or light a living room. But how is that affecting the environment? How is that affecting the land, sacred lands of indigenous communities? How is that affecting individuals that either live off of that work or are negatively impacted by the environmental degradation that occurs from that?
Okay.
And to add on to that economic aspect, are we going into a land basically producing more environmental degradation than what is economically favorable? Or what is economic profit going to be off of that? Are we going in to extract just a little bit and just leaving a huge mess behind? We're going to clean it up. How much is going to take to clean up that mess that we're making? It's very complex when you really look at the whole picture.
So that's kind of like risk versus reward when digging and one of those. Interesting. So you mentioned it has an effect on indigenous people?
Yes.
Because of their land?
Yes.
And us drilling?
Yes. So in indigenous communities, there's a spiritual tie to earth. In fact, it's very interesting. The word sustainability is a Western society word. It's not a word, that indigenous communities understand, or that came from that community, because it's a way of life. So every single day, the connection with water, the connection to air, the connection to wildlife is inherent to their culture, to the way of being, to the religious tie to that. Whereas in Western society, we had to kind of develop that word to try to understand how can we combat this environmental degradation mess that we're in now, and the high population that we have. How can we find the balance? That's where sustainability comes into play.
My phone's dinging. Hold on. I should have put this on silent. So I'm listening, and it's obviously sounds like a balance between population and versus resources.
In a sense, yes.
And you're trying to find that proper balance? Is that...
in a vague way.
I'm stupid, so it's okay. You can say no.
No, you're not stupid. It's just that it's much more complex, like I said, than that. So you have to take into account that a piece of land is not just a piece of land to certain communities, certain cultures. Whereas for maybe a multi-billion dollar company, it is. And so that company is not going to experience that effect as that community that thrives off of that land would.
So hearing you, the way you describe this, sounds like the movie Avatar to me.
Yes.
Right? So because you have the indigenous people, that's their community, that's their land, you have this multi-million-dollar company, and they want to come to take the resources from their land and essentially killing their heritage where they come from.
Exactly.
Okay. So we were talking earlier, before we started.
Right.
Was it the discrimination or the
environmental racism?
Environmental racism. And that's two words I've never heard together.
Yes. Most people have not. It's not something that is necessarily talked about.
Environmental
racism. Yes.
Okay.
It's a topic that dates back to systemic racism, the roots of it.
Okay.
Jim Crow era, real estate. I mentioned the real estate discrimination that was happening with the policies where minorities weren't allowed to live in certain neighborhoods gentrification is what we call it now.
Right.
It still occurs to this day. And because of redlining, what ended up happening was that certain sections of the city were deemed, oh, this is a very great place to live at. This is okay. This one is not. This is where we're going to put all the minorities.
Right.
But it wasn't just where individuals were living. It was also deemed areas where landfill waste was located. A great example of this in our city at the moment is Paramore community in downtown Orlando.
In Orlando.
Yes. Currently, there's about, if I remember the number correct, it's about 202 Superfund sites. The Superfund is like a law policy that the U.S. came up with to essentially go into an area that has experienced environmental toxic waste, high amounts of it, very harmful to the environment and to humans. And they go in with the resources to clean it up and make it a place where we can live, animals and biodiversity can increase and thrive.
Okay.
In Paramore community, there's 202 Superfund sites that have not been cleaned. They are ignored. So you have agencies like the Superfund and the EPA that unfortunately turn their site away from areas like that.
Why is that? Like, why would they not clean it up? Like
discrimination.
Just
That's,
like
yeah.
top of the list.
It leads back to environmental racism. That term itself was coined by Robert D. Bullard. He's considered the father of environmental justice back in 1970, 1980. And he really looked at all those factors that I talked about, the Jim Crow era, systemic racism, how communities, specifically minority, were more affected by specific environmental factors like air quality. Mm-hmm. In fact, you take into consideration COVID-19 right now, why are Hispanic and African American communities the most affected by COVID? It's because they have been predisposed to bad air quality that has already kind of stressed their systems, their internal systems, and led them to be in a situation where they're more vulnerable than perhaps more high privileged communities.
So like their body or their immune system is just more broken down and
exactly
not as tough. So like, you say that, I think of like Flint, Michigan, with like the water situation that's been going on for years, essentially at this point.
Yeah, that's such an unfortunate situation, and that ties directly into environmental racism.
Okay.
Why is it that 100 and so miles away from Flint, Michigan, there was another situation happening with water in a city that I can't recall at the moment.
Yeah.
But they were receiving help, whereas in Flint, Michigan, they weren't.
And that was if I remember, it was like lead in the water.
Yes.
And they're not cleaning it. There's not.
Right. So the politicians, they were trying to save money. The governors were trying to save money for the city. And so they changed the type of water source they were using to the Flint River, which in itself, without going into the homes of these individuals, it really smelled bad. Mm-hmm. It just the color and everything was just really disgusting. And so there were people that actually died. They got contaminated with what's called Legionnaire's disease, which just impacts your entire body. A lot of people lost their hair. A lot of irreversible conditions occurred because of that. In fact, if I remember correctly, a nearby city, Detroit, I believe, was trying to work with Flint to provide clean water, and they denied it. So at one point they did provide filters, water filters.
Yeah.
What we would call short-term quick fix.
Okay.
It's only a quick fix for the moment. Filter here and there. You're not gonna put a filter in everything in your shower.
Right.
Right. So it really wasn't going into the root of the problem necessarily.
And so you're saying that it's believed that that's because just racism, because colored people, if it was more of a community, like a privileged community, they would definitely fix the problem a lot sooner. Mm-hmm.
And a great example of that is the Navajo Nation, indigenous community. For years, I believe it was the Cold War, the U.S. bought the land in order to have open uranium mines. The deal was they would give indigenous community members a job. And so in the short term, it was great for them. Mm-hmm. They were able to work. But the uranium mines are still open. people are literally living in houses built of uranium. And so you're seeing individuals of 30-something our age with stomach with stomach cancer, people that are dying, and that does not affect just the present generations, but the future generations too. It affects fertility. It affects future children that are growing up in that land. And just to go back, I was kind of going off a tangent there, but a couple of miles away, 150 or so miles away, there was an issue similar to that, and the EPA responded really quickly in Colorado, I believe. And that specific community is mostly predominantly white.
I think for me, definitely, personally, I think racism obviously exists, but just like to play devil's advocate, is it more like the privileged community, we can benefit more from solving that problem quicker than the community of color or poverty. The benefit is not really there, so that just gets put on the back end. And it's just like, well, why? Then the question is, why is the benefit not there?
Right.
So, so what do you think, like, the solution is? Do you just find, like, do you elect somebody that wants to focus on that? Or, because I think to me, like, I work very, like, I try to reverse engineer, and that's how my mind works. So it's not like, well, this community, we're not going to benefit from that community, so we're not going to solve that problem.
Right, right.
So to me, in my mind, okay, well, what can we do to this community to increase the benefit? Right? Not, okay, we need to solve this problem. Because if I solve that problem, then for future problems, the benefit's still not going to be there.
Right.
So you need to go to the root of it, increase the benefit in the community. So any problem they have, we need to address it because the benefit is worth it.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, you mentioned the root, and that's the thing. You mentioned also policies. So you take the EPA, you look at the definition. The definition talks about equality, providing equal environmental safety, more or less in those words, for everyone. But is what a privileged white, predominantly Caucasian community, what their needs, are those needs the same as that Paramore community that I mentioned? They're not at all.
No.
I mean, we're talking about such wide range of factors here on many different levels. So when we look at that definition, it's not fair. It's not equal as it's trying to see that as it is for all the members.
Right.
Right. So to answer your question, yes, it would lead to looking at who can we elect that can actually pay attention to the entirety, not just focusing on one specific area and then turning their sight to another specific community.
So the thing with, all right, I hear you saying equality, right? And there's equality of opportunity to give everybody the opportunity, equal opportunity. And then there's equality of outcome. So there's some that would say equality of outcome is impossible because there's too many categories to be equal on. It's literally infinite, right? Your color, race, age, wealth, like you can name 100.
Oh yes.
So equality of outcome is essentially impossible.
Right.
So we can never get there. So with that, like, I guess where I'm going is we can't have communities essentially that are equal to each other in a literal standpoint.
Yes.
In a literal, right?
Yes.
And you know me to be very literal.
Yes.
So like listening to you say that, like, that's essentially impossible.
It is.
But I think the goal is maybe to find a closer balance, maybe. No, am I wrong?
Well,
like, if it's impossible, then what are you working towards?
Well, that's when you introduce the term equity.
And what is
equity? Is
value? What equity? Equity to me is value.
Okay. When it comes to equality says that you and I both, no matter where we're from, we deserve the exact same amount of resources. Equity says, hold on, perhaps you are more privileged than I am. perhaps you were already born in the U.S. Perhaps I was not. So that means I have to work a little bit harder to achieve what you already have either achieved or are trying to achieve.
Gotcha.
And so equity looks at what are the barriers, what are the privileges that are allowing an individual, if we're looking at a case by case or a community, to thrive and succeed, and what are the challenges and barriers that are preventing a specific community that already have pre-existing barriers or challenges in place. Like, how can we make it so that they also have the same possibility to succeed as the ones that already have privilege?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I'm with you there. You don't want to. I got you. So it's just like, just because you weren't born here, just because you don't have certain privileges, I don't want to cripple you further.
Exactly.
I want to help you to get to where.
Exactly.
Right, I got you.
And so when you look at it from an outside, not understanding maybe like the root and certain factors of society and culture, norms, and policies and politics. It looks like, well, why can't we give everyone everything the same thing? Well, it doesn't work like that, because maybe you can give someone the same thing as the other person, but they maybe don't need it.
Right.
Maybe this individual might need a little bit more resources because they're already facing so many challenges as is. So when we go back to environmental racism, we talk about the individuals that were bedlined, and now generations later, their children or children's are living in that area. They're dealing from the historical factors,
right,
and now also being affected by the current environmental issues there too. So it's harder. Exactly. Oh, it's so much harder.
Yeah, I know. I'm with you with the whole, like, some certain people don't need as many resources as others. COVID example, I was like, Karen, you don't need all that toilet paper. I need some. Like,
sure.
I'm just, right? Like, am I lying? Like,
no.
Yeah, right? I'm just trying to lighten the mood. So yeah, no, I got you. So it's just weird because, like, environmental racism, it's literally, until today, it's not a term that I've heard tossed around. So it's definitely new to me. I feel like it's probably going to be new to a lot of people.
Yes. I had a chance to really dive into it. Even having a biology, environmental science background, I wasn't really all that, knowledgeable on the term myself. And I had a chance to really dive into it. I did a co-op classes for a prison. I was teaching a few of the younger inmates about water security as well as environmental racism. That was my chance to really get into that. And then last semester in my PhD career, I was able to dive into the indigenous communities, specifically with environmental racism. So it really takes you seeking the resources sometimes, because it's not something that the government is going to, put out there.
Right, yeah, no. They're not. It's just the way our government works.
Yes. I mean, not to say that the government doesn't do, good things for the society, but
I'll say it, they don't.
But as a whole, yeah.
I don't want to get into politics.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah.
But please don't.
But we were talking earlier, and you mentioned I just want to switch the topic a bit to recycling.
Yes.
And you said recycling is like.
It's not bad.
It's not bad. Does that mean
it's not the best? So society and cultural norms make us believe that consume as you need, just recycle. You'll be a good civilian. You'll be good for the environment. Not necessarily the case. So the number one preferred method of waste management is to reduce or reuse. Reduce
waste.
Yes.
Or reuse.
Or reuse.
Okay. Repurpose.
Yes.
Right.
And so reusing many people can be like, well, isn't recycling a form of reusing? In a sense, but the thing is, when you look at the waste stream, we talk about circular and linear waste stream. Yes.
Okay.
A circle and a line.
I'm a visual person.
Yeah. So we take a look. Okay, what are you gonna do with your?
I'm gonna drink this. We don't have a sponsorship. I
wasn't trying to put you on the spot, but is it an example? You're saying you're visual. We don't know who's visual.
I'm gonna drink this delicious drink here, and then I'm gonna pop the cap for my daughter because they collect them, and then I'm gonna throw the can in my recycle bin, and I'm gonna put the recycle bin outside when they pick it up. So am I? Clearly, it sounds like I'm not doing enough.
It's not so much that you're not doing enough. You're doing what you can with what you have, right? So you're consuming what you want and you're disposing of it responsibly. But the thing is that when you take into account bottled water. I know we've talked about that in the past.
Yep.
And so a lot of us have the privilege to go to the store, purchase $1 or $1.50 bottle of water. You know, we're thirsty, it's Florida, it's always hot.
Always.
Many of us have that resource. Or at home we have a filter or whatever the case may be. But what happens to that plastic once it's gone? Is it going straight into the trash? So the point here would be rather than to continue to introduce that plastic into the waste stream, which would be a linear form.
Got you.
Right, is how can we prevent that? I can buy a reusable bottle of water, or water bottle, sorry, and then just continue to reuse that. I would stop my production of plastic into that waste stream, so whether it's recycling or not. So
basically, consuming water out of the same bottle, like a Yeti or like a Tervis or anything, just reusing the cup.
You're already making such a huge difference just by that itself, because you're also saying no to a multi-billion-dollar, whatever the dollar amount is, of a company that doesn't really need your money.
Right.
It's benefiting, going back to racism, is benefiting from an area that they're getting a free resource. That's because water, like air, is free for all of us. It's found in nature naturally, right?
Right.
They're taking that free resource and benefiting hugely from that, immensely from that. And so you're also saying no to that, to the capitalist aspect of it.
But couldn't you theoretically, you could take it further and you could collect your own water from rain?
Yes, actually a lot of people do that.
There's people that do that.
It depends on the county and the state. Because standing water can be really bad too. It can lead to dengue. It can lead to a lot of diseases because of mosquitoes. So it depends. But there are specific systems that you can install to the outside of your home. Some are very expensive and really expensive as well, and some are really simple. So it also depends where you live. It doesn't rain equally everywhere as well. So
interesting. Interesting. What else you got?
In what aspect?
I just had a quick thought about going back to the environmental racism, because we had talked about, or you had mentioned food.
Yes, food security.
Food security, and like to me, if you ask me food security, I'm like, yeah, I got a freezer. It'll preserve my food for me as long as I need it, as long as I have energy to keep it frozen for sure. But how does that apply to like different communities, I guess?
Oh, in every way. All these topics really interrelate to each other. And food security, it deals with so much. It deals with the agricultural aspects of it. Did we use water sustainably? The land that we grew it on, was it land that belonged to an indigenous community?
Are you saying the land that we grew water on, or
no, like
food?
A crop.
Oh, okay, crops. Okay.
How are we growing that crop? Are we introducing GMOs, genetically modified organisms?
Right.
Are we using pesticides or not? Is the fertilizers that we're using, is that acting as runoff with the rain? The rain falls onto the ground, runoffs, as the name suggests, with the water into nearby water systems, impacting aquatic organisms negatively because of the chemicals that accumulate into there.
From the runoff?
Yes. It looks at who is getting that food. How much of that food is actually getting wasted? Between 1950 to now, the average plate of the American plate, family plate, has increased by 60%. More space, it's called white space. More space means, well, I can just put more. I'm hungry. I can put more food.
Is that, so I just want to start, is that like in Western civilization? Because I feel like in the Western civilization, we definitely eat way more than we're supposed to.
Yes.
But in other countries, their portion size is a lot smaller.
America is known as a throwaway society.
Right.
For sure.
So that stat that you're putting as Western is for us?
Mostly.
Okay.
Mostly, yes.
Okay.
This is going to vary tremendously depending on the developing the country, what part of the world, their cultural eating habits, so on and so forth.
Okay, so it differs.
But typically, it has increased by 60%. So someone who's hungry is...
over how long?
Like 1950 to now.
Alright, so like 70 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's increased more. So that means that psychologically, we know when we have more space, I'm going to be hungry. But then what happens when you eat more, you eat more than half, what happens to the rest of the food? Does it get thrown away? Does it get composted? What happens to it? So now that percent of that food is thrown away, that's increasing waste management. So it goes back to what we talked about a little bit with the water as far as linear and circular waste. And it also goes to show like, okay, there are individuals who don't even have the privilege. I mentioned privilege again because that's a huge thing when it comes to sustainability and the environment. You know, there are people that don't have the privilege of even having a plate that big, of having that much food to put on a plate.
Right.
So it looks at that as well. I also talked earlier about food deserts. Food deserts, there are a lot of communities, specifically minority communities, that the restaurants, the food companies, lost my word there, that are in that area are mainly fast food, what we would deem as unhealthy.
Unhealthy.
Although technically healthy, unhealthy, everyone may have their own definition of that. And everyone can have a different definition of food security. Because maybe you mentioned you have a freezer full of food.
Right.
Maybe for you that's what food security means. Maybe for somebody else, food security is I have food that I used to eat back in my country, for example.
Okay.
So food desert, going back to that, talks about, okay, this specific community is exposed to these options, whatever those options are, not to name franchises.
McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's.
There you go.
Checkers.
Yes. So why aren't they not exposed to Whole Foods? Why are not they're not exposed to fresh markets?
But so to me, like as a business-minded person, they're not, because I can't go into a low-poverty neighborhood and put something that's like, let's say, expensive or high quality. I can't go to a third world country and sell Cadillacs. It's not a good business.
Technically you can, but yes.
I'm not going to sell anything if no one can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
So that'd be a terrible business idea. So I can't go to a low income neighborhood with a Whole Foods if they barely have money to buy low quality meats. Then there's no way they have money to buy high quality meats.
But the thing is that a lot of these communities they have not even had the experience to know what a Whole Foods might look like. Because their whole lives, they were just exposed to these options. Not to mention transportation. I mean, Florida's a great example of that.
Right.
Transportation is difficult here. Maybe they just didn't have the means to actually get in a car and drive to Whole Foods. Maybe they have the option to maybe splurge a little bit here and there. Maybe buy, a healthier option. But I see what you mean as far as business.
Mm-hmm.
But why are the healthy foods so expensive in the first place?
Right.
A lot of peer-reviewed journals make it sound as though, for example, African Americans are predisposed to heart disease because of the diets that they might have. Clearly, it's not written in that way, but
right.
In a nutshell. And it makes it sound like it's that culture, that group, that ethnic group, or whatever. But it's not.
Right. It's the food they eat.
Exactly. It's what they're exposed to. It's the resources that they have. Going back to equity versus inequality or equality. It's the fact that what they're exposed to.
So one thing, all right, I'm in 100% agreement with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think going to if you put it in a timeline,
mm-hmm.
for me, I just don't feel the sample size has been large enough. And let me explain.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say, systemic and everything we're talking about is Western civilization.
Mm-hmm.
This country is 3 generations old, right? We're 300 years old, maybe 4, right? That's a very small amount of time to achieve things we're talking about achieving, inequality. Time is relative, right? And whatever you want to believe, the universe is billions of years old, which we can't even fathom that, right?
Right.
You can't fathom what a billion years is even like, let alone 400 years, which was 1776, right? So, that is, to me, it's just such a small amount of time to achieve the things everyone talks about. So it's anything in progress to achieve a goal, especially in this scenario, or even fitness, or you want to lose weight or anything like that, you want to be a millionaire, right? It's all incremental. It's all small steps. And I feel personally that technology is advanced so far in that short period of time that we want everything else to advance. And it's just like instant gratification. And we can't have that. And it's just like, everybody's just angry with each other. Yes. But if you sit back and you look at the whole picture, I think, we're not where we want to be. But if you look at how far we've come along in 3.5 generations, I mean, it's moved along.
But why have we had enough time, even in that short period of time, to adjust to the higher class, higher privileged communities and continue to not help or assist those that are in more need? Because at the end of the day, what we're doing, and politicians, I mean, again, we don't want to get into,
don't want to get involved.
But that's a huge part of this. Over time, we're seeing that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
Right.
And that gap is widening. That gap of inequality.
For sure.
So sure, we've had a short, relatively amount of time. But it's been enough time for privileged people to be more than successful, given what more than they need.
Yeah.
So, we can argue both. We can argue, has it been enough time to really establish world peace, technically, right? But it's also been enough time to establish a lot of other things that only continue to perpetuate the oppression and systemic racism that a lot of individuals only suffer from. So it's two different ways.
I think a lot of that too is just greed and power. Yeah, for sure. Have you seen people wearing my eye, like allergies? My eyes are watering. I'm sorry. I apologize.
You're good.
Oh, it's that season. So all right. If there's one thing you can fix, like if you had a magic wand, and you can just one thing we can fix for the whole entire world.
Oh, that's a hard one.
In this realm of conversation.
Well, I'll answer that by providing an example.
Okay.
So within the students that I teach, one thing that I notice in the environmental science courses, and even in some of the biology courses I teach, is that this idea of my specific actions don't matter. Like, so what? I buy a bunch of bottled water that's plastic. I'm not gonna make a difference. So I think that if anything, I would want to work, and I'm starting to really dive into that with students. It's been really difficult teaching online because it's a disconnect, right? But even then, what I would really want to focus on is, why do you feel that your actions are any less powerful than your entire community? It really starts with each and every single one of us.
Right.
And so the minute that I hear someone say, I'm not, whatever I do is not gonna do anything, why are you disempowering yourself? Why are you choosing to look at your actions as it not having a purpose?
I think that goes back to education.
Right. But it goes back, even in education, there's a whole lot of things that we can talk about. That's a whole other podcast. But you're right, it goes back to education. Yeah,
it's just teachings. Mm-hmm. That goes literally, my small, bringing this bottle with me and not buying plastic water bottles is not going to make a big difference. Mm-hmm. It literally goes back to everything's incremental. It's incremental growth, and I just think it's instant gratification.
But it's also important to teach, especially the youth, that it starts by a little thing. Mm-hmm. It starts by looking at, what am I eating when I go into a grocery store? What am I buying? Who am I supporting by what I'm buying? What are the underlying rules, underlying systems that I'm supporting by what I'm going in to buy and consume? How is what I'm doing every single day that seem like such small actions, like what I eat, or where I drive, or what I drive, or what I drink, or whatever the case is like that, looking at what long-term consequences that has, what repercussions it has on individuals who are not as privileged as you are, who do not have the resources that you have. So you're right, it has to do with education, because you learn through education and personal experience what ethics and values you adopt. Right. And so with that, you start to shift your mind, your thinking, and then you start to shift your actions, because now you have this system of thinking, of thoughts, belief systems, that values, so on and so forth, that now, in a sense, control or dictate, that would be the better word, what your actions might be.
Right.
So that's something I've started, like I said, implementing in my courses. Even though with the disconnect of online teaching, I've had students work on projects where they take it, to their specific immediate community. With waste management has been one, food security has been one too. And they look at the repercussions of it. For example, for food security, I've had students log for about 3 or 4 days what they're eating, whatever it may be. They don't have to alter anything or change anything. It can be as little or as much as they eat. What are they doing with the trash? What are they doing with the
throwing
food?
It away.
Composting, recycling, or throwing away.
Okay.
So circular, linear.
Composting.
Right. What they're eating, how much water was used to grow each of the raw ingredients or products, how much carbon was exposed into the environment with the transportation of those foods. So it's looking at all these details that are so connected to everyday actions that we don't think about it because we've never really been educated.
Right.
You're in school and no one really teaches you, oh, you have to eat healthy, but these are also the things that happen to the environment, to the world, when you choose to eat a certain kind of diet or whatever the case is. So that's kind of a long answer, but in other words, to answer their first original question, it's basically to help people feel empowered, to understand that it starts with them, and it's little things here and there. And it's not, you wake up tomorrow, you're immediately sustainable. I myself, I'm still working on having a fully sustainable life because we've all been geared in the same society of consume what you need and what you want if you can afford it, right? If you have the resources for it. So adapting that to where you're like, okay, wait, I'm going to step outside of that and be more conscious and intentful of my actions. That takes a lot. That takes a lot of conscious thinking every single day. So it takes a bit.
And you're just fighting the urge to put others in the community and the environment before yours. Okay, cool. Yeah. Let people know that their small difference actually makes a huge difference in the long term.
There's actually, if I can add this.
Of course, the floor is yours.
I designed for my PhD course last semester. I designed a course on food security that I hopefully can implement in the schools I teach. It's half and half, so 8 weeks of conceptual learning. We'll talk about the food deserts, we'll talk about environmental racism, we'll talk about food security, water security, the agricultural systems that both sustainable and unsustainable that go into food production. And then the next 8 weeks, it's all hands-on. I teach the students, or I say but it's because I've made the course, but it would be a community effort to teach the students how to grow their own grains, their own veggies, and possibly fruit. Food is the harder one.
It takes too much time. Who has time for that?
Using on-campus resources.
Who has time?
It's much easier than you think.
I gotta work 60 hours. I got a family.
It's much easier than you think, but it's not to say, okay,
I gotta
everybody.
go to the gym, and I gotta grow my own grains. Chipotle's right there.
What I'm saying is, you don't have to go home and have a farm behind your house, but it's an option for students that don't have that food security. Hey, you can still find a way to provide in a sustainable manner. It's providing students also with something called biophilia. Biophilia is something we all have. It's innate to humanity. It's the fact that when we're inside an office working all day, we're like, it's dreadful.
All mundane.
Yeah, and when you're outside in nature, walking in trails, your spirits lift up because there's that connection to nature, which is where we come from too. So it's doing many different things. It's also working with stress levels. It's also working with physical state of health with students. It's many different factors. And so that's one way that I hope to maybe help students feel a little bit more empowered to see that, hey, I was able to grow that. I was able to learn how to do this, and maybe I can do that for my community.
Right. No, I like that. There's definitely, and I know there's communities out there in our country that they have community gardens.
Yes.
And they all grow their own produce and stuff like that. Yeah, that's real nice.
Yeah. So, see.
Cool. Well, I think you send me some information. I would like to, because I definitely could do better, for sure.
Okay. We all can. Me, myself, anybody, anyone can.
True.
So.
But I think we're gonna probably wrap this up.
Okay.
I think we've gone long enough. I do want to thank you for coming out. I know you were nervous.
A little bit.
Wasn't that bad?
No.
It wasn't that bad.
No.
But yeah, definitely come back. I like going back and forth. You know, I like pushing your buttons.
I know. Since the beginning. It's a thing.
Economics. I know you're studying that for a little bit. We talked about that briefly. Politics. You know, we can always go back and forth. So, but thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me. So.
And that's it, folks.